Since you're going to be interviewed for this book in, 3 or 4 days, I guess, about your recollections of the origins of UCS and Henry Kendall and the beginnings of the modern environmental movement, what are some of the things that you're planning to talk about to that author?
Well, they're interested in the evolution of the environmental movement, and that in turn had a major emphasis from the environmental movement. The environmental movement and the development of arms control and the policies related to that are all together, and you can't just ignore one and not do the other injustice.
So UCS addressed a range of linked issues, including the environment and nuclear proliferation, arms control, and those sorts of things?
Yes, when UCS got started, it got started by a couple of graduate students from Cornell University who were studying physics at MIT during a year away from the home school. And their professors were Kurt Gottfried and other professors who were high-energy physicists and very much involved with this. Initially, faculty were involved with the focus on arms control. They're interested in nuclear arms, anti-ballistic missile system, and other arms control projects. And from that grew the disenchantment that materialized in these organizations. And as a result, they focused on both. The students dubbed themselves the Science Action Coordinating Committee, which was a mouthful. No one liked it. Almost as many disliked the Union of Concerned Scientists. But they're here to stay, so we'll probably live with them. And the focus of the subjects went from arms control and chemical warfare and such things at the beginning to more environmental things. The first paper officially released by UCS was about the poor quality of managing environmental wastes in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Air pollution, sulfur dioxide air pollution, the levels were very high, and there were only a few people who were involved in the environmental movement who were also involved in the chemical and military applications in what these students called misuse of science and technology in their doing the daily events. They wanted the professors to recognize and publicly state that it was wrong for academics to be developing military applications for things that are inherently safe in the development.
So you were doing postgraduate work at MIT at that time?
Yes, I finished my work in physics at University of Minnesota, where I got my degree. And then I spent 2 years at Audubon National Laboratory, and I was just getting through my first year at MIT doing traditional research when the students brought to the forefront these problems. And I became enmeshed with them as well as others. And from that evolved the Union of Concerned Scientists. At the beginning, there were very few people involved, and there were maybe a dozen who met regularly, wrote reports. ABM was one, chemical and biological warfare was another one. But after that, it started dwindling down. The professors had to go back to or wanted to go back to their basic research, felt the burden of these decisions shouldn't be solely on them. But the topics that were the subject matter went from arms control to environmental movement, and has stayed there since. When I first got active in the UCS program, there were only a few people involved, including myself, Henry Kendall, who was professor of physics, Nobel Prize winner, and a brilliant scientist. And so he and I were kind of did the organizing, and it was successful. Henry was a gifted organizer, not in a political sense, but in structuring the issues. So as the program went on further, some of the students shifted from physics to political science. And I shifted myself from physics to environmental critiquing of programs, and this kind of large-scale shift got reflected in the structure of the colleges. And students who might have gotten advanced degrees in science and engineering were considering economic engineering type programs where they could try and affect some decision making, and to do so in terms that the students could understand as well as other professors.
So how did you meet Henry? Were there sort of rallies or sort of think tank meetings, or how did you get together?
I worked at the Center for Theoretical Physics at MIT, and it is an awesome place to work. The people were typical Nobel Prize people. Henry himself, a fellow named Stephen Weinberg, cosmological scientist, others, and we brown bagged it to lunch every day. I mean, it was a small lunchroom, and we would chat about physics or about events of the day, really. And that's where I got to know Henry. And we were kindred spirits in many respects. We worked on the same issues, and we were similar in other respects. I mean, he was a photographer. I was taking pictures myself, and it's just a small reflection of how we sort of thought alike.
So in forming UCS, where you ended up with yourself as the first president and he was first chairman or something like that, maybe you can refresh my memory as to the titles and sort of how it ended up. Were you two part of a bigger group at that point and just the most involved?
Well, I wouldn't overstress the fact that Henry was vice president, and I was president. We just needed something to put our name on the mailbox at MIT where we got our mail. And there was no formal meeting with a lot of people voting. I mean, it just didn't act that way. It didn't work out that way. And let me give you an example. The first paper we did was on air pollution, pesticides, and other environmental problems as they were regulated by the state of Massachusetts. And we did a report on that. The report was about 50 pages long, and it, strangely enough, was put together by a bunch of graduate students. I mean, Henry was working on his physics and working on this as well, but the students did the work, and we ran off the paper on a mimeograph machine. That's how primitive things were at that time. Upstairs in the Audubon building, ran this turning out copies of the report, and that was kind of the level. It was a shoestring operation.
And so how was that paper received when the copies got out?
Well, it was interesting. I remember the day that we had the press conference. It was our first press conference, and we were sitting around a table, and we had a prepared statement, which Henry gave, and the reporters were at first very skeptical. Who are you people? They said. Who are you to represent yourself? What do you know about these subjects? Why should we believe you? And then we just turned it around and we described the facts that we amassed and the kinds of programs that we reviewed. And so using the facts of and on the face of it, I think we made a pretty compelling case that you can compelling case that these problems are real and must be addressed and would have been addressed if the recommendations of that report were carried out. And over the years, you see us report, we issued reports of many topics. The books on radioactive waste disposal, books on solar energy, mostly energy related, because that's kind of where you find your niche if you're a physicist, as opposed to chemical engineering, which is relevant for dealing with biological and chemical problems, but not so much for the hard engineering.
So how did UCS grow then and end up doing fundraising and getting members and staff and office in DC?
Yeah. Well, MIT, where most of this activity occurred, is a very liberal place. And if a bunch of students want to have a meeting, they can have a meeting. And so there were meetings still on the chemical and biological warfare and meetings on related topics. And so I don't know whether someone paid $5 for the rental of a room or whether they just let us use an empty classroom or something. But there was an inherent interest in the topic, and there was no big expenses that we incurred while we were doing this. And we were not writing major reports. So we felt it was necessary to have some way of contacting us, so we wrote we rented a mailbox, is what we did, at MIT station, mailbox station down at, and that pretty much met our requirements. Mailbox, someone writes to us, and we didn't have anyone to answer it, we didn't have a phone. But after a while, someone would give us a $50 donation. They couldn't take a tax deduction because we weren't tax exempt. It didn't exist. But we went on and pursued topics of interest as they arose, because there weren't paid staff. There were just people, graduate students, who felt the need to do something, and so they did. But eventually, we got some grants from foundations to support the organization, hire a secretary part-time perhaps, and rent a small office. And we did this for some length of time. Unfortunately, about a month ago, I threw out most of my old reports. I thought who was ever going to be interested in this. And I went through all those papers and all the reports and nuclear waste disposal and blah, blah. It's all gone, unfortunately. So I was going to try and archive it somehow, but couldn't find much interest.
So how long did you stay kind of highly active in UCS? You were working for the Audubon Society also during the 70s, right? Mass Audubon.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1977, you started working for CEQ in Washington. So
much of it came to initial action activities came to a head in the late 60s, and in 1970 I had to do something in terms of a job, because at that point I had not been offered anything with the Audubon Society, and I had just been earning a little money from gifts that were made to the organization, but that couldn't go on either. And then the Massachusetts Audubon Society came to my rescue, and they offered me a position on their scientific staff to work on things like solar energy and topics like that, conservation. And that was in 1970. And I continued along that line through 1977. And at that point, their Audubon's funding was growing thin. And I had to find something else. And just at that time then, the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, came to my rescue. I was working in the yard doing something one day, and the phone rang, and it was the staff director at CEQ in Washington, and he asked me if I'd be interested in working at CEQ at triple the salary that I had at the Audubon Society. And I said, yeah, I think I could get interested in that.
And then, so when Reagan came in, you went back to UCS in Washington, right?
Yeah, I actually had never worked formally for UCS. I got paid by the Audubon Society, but I was working really for UCS, but my paycheck came from the Audubon Society.
So for Audubon, when you were working for them, you were doing not typical Audubon Society type work having to do with nature conservation, but you were dealing more with energy and energy conservation issues.
That's right. We had I persuaded Audubon that we wanted to solarize the gift shop, and they put on an elaborate system with water transmitting the heat from the collectors on the roof and to the heating elements. So that's exactly right. But the members of Audubon, while were very concerned with the environment, they knew that if the birds go, we're the next in line. And so they approved the kinds of things that I was doing, as well as the other members of the staff. And that included conservation, education programs, and so forth.
So after CEQ, then, after Reagan came into office, you needed another job, another opportunity. So how did you wind up actually working for UCS then?
Well, they had an office in Washington at that time, half a dozen people, and I approached them and asked if I could serve on the staff there. And they said yes. So I moved all my paper up the street to DuPont Circle. I actually went to and I worked there for 7 years.
So did you continue working on many of the same issues still then?
You know, it was the same. The staff had more lawyers in DC, engineers, and the work tended to follow on them.
So how did you get involved in analyzing or making policy recommendations for these technologies?
Interesting question. I was in the late 60s working for the Audubon Society, but really working on the issues of conservation, energy, and power plant performance. And I was doing mostly writing on the subject, but then things got warmed up, and I was asked to participate in hearings. And in this case, it meant the Pilgrim Power Plant in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they asked me, they being the citizens groups, asked me if I would write testimony to the effect that the standards are inadequate to protect the public health, basically. And I testified, a little more elaboration than that, but they basically copped out and did everything I asked them to do, so that on that particular set of issues, they did what they were supposed to do. But mostly it was difficult to get a solution, a clean, neat solution. In the case of power plants like Pilgrim, so-called Plymouth Power Plant and Pilgrim, had a range of safety hazards that was just very, very, very serious. And they took a long time before they finally tried to get those fractures from the power plants fixed. When these power plants, as I say, if the steel vessel cracks, then the water runs out, and the water is the cooling water, which means that if they don't have the cooling water, they're not going to cool the power plant. It's that simple. And you'd think they would want to be the first on the scene to fix it, but they didn't. They were not. And as a result, ultimately the fate of the industry was at risk.
And no new nuclear power plants have been started in the U.S. since the 3 Mile Island incident.
Yeah, well, they canceled some back too, so I think I think it's 73 power plants. The last 73 have been canceled. And there's talk of they're building some experimental plants that will be adequately safe. And I'm skeptical that they're going to do it. The industry has the resources to build a big nuclear plant, but they don't have the resources to deal with its design and safety hazards. And that's where we got into them through UCS, the Union of Concerned Scientists. Henry Kendall was becoming more involved and unhappy with the power plant performance. And he did analysis of the safety of the power plants that showed that the manufacturers had falsified the data, the test data, in building the nuclear power plant. And that, what can be said? That's just totally unwarranted. And but they did it, and as a result, a lot of power plants had to be fixed over because they were inadequate at that time.